It was like a light bulb went off when she walked in and all eyes were on her. In Pretty Woman and American Gigolo, Richard Gere starred in movies that captivated millions of people. But at age 74, he didn't talk about a part, a movie, or an accomplishment. He only talked about a woman. A simple truth that stopped everything for a second. I didn't split up with them because they were wrong. I'm no longer married because I wasn't strong enough to stay together. It wasn't about finding the right person, it was about becoming the right person at the right time for that person. This man had been married 3 times and was once called the most beautiful gentleman in Hollywood. He used to love the most beautiful women in the world, married one of the best supermodels in the world, and was the media and movie stars' favorite. But he didn't find a relationship he didn't have to hold on to until he was almost 70. He found love that didn't demand performance, and a woman who didn't come to change him but to stay. And Richard Gere said, she is the true love of his life. This isn't just the love story of a movie star, it's the story of a man from fame to solitude, from fear to peace, from control to understanding, a journey to learn how to love. Not by instinct but by growth. Before he was a movie star, Richard Gere was a skinny young man from Pennsylvania who played the trumpet, wrote music for school plays, and studied philosophy at the University of Massachusetts. But he left everything behind to go into theater, where he could be himself. Someone else, live a different life. And maybe Richard Gere got used to being the charming man early on, both on screen and in real life. He was always getting women's attention with his sexy good looks and mysterious quiet personality. But Richard always seemed to evade definitions, and the same was true of his early relationships. They were strong enough to be addicting, but they never lasted long enough to hold on. Among them were fiery model Mallory, who once called him a jewel shooting across the sky, Dawn Steele, an editor at Penthouse, who later became the first woman to run a major U.S. film studio, Penelope Milford, his Days of Heaven co-star who stayed with him through the 1970s, and his short but deeply impactful relationship with Sylvia, the woman who took him to Nepal, showed him Tibetan lamas, and introduced him to Buddhism and meditation. They were both beautiful, smart, and brave. But for Richard Gere at the time, love was just a short part of his journey to find himself. He had just finished looking for Mr. Goodbar, Days of Heaven, and American Gigolo. But he was also falling into a place where no one had ever taught him how to keep a woman. The whispers at parties, the paparazzi flashbulbs, and the lonely nights in hotel rooms after shooting all seemed to blend together, painting a picture of Richard Gere, who looked great on the outside but was empty on the inside. That might be why he never really wanted to settle down. The women kept coming and going because he didn't know what he needed yet, not deep enough to keep or safe enough to trust. All he knew was that he was living fast and wasn't ready to stop. In 1988, Richard Gere, who was 39 years old at the time, met Cindy Crawford, who was 22 and had just been on the covers of the world's best fashion magazines. They came from very different backgrounds. One person called him the sexiest man alive, and another said she was the next big thing in the fashion world. They fell in love quickly, deeply, and out of the blue. Soon after, they moved in together in New York, and everyone was amazed. Richard Gere was known as the cool and classy gentleman, and Cindy Crawford was known as the most beautiful woman in the world. They were on red carpets, in ads, and on magazine covers, and they became the iconic couple of the 1990s. But behind the scenes, they were two people who moved at very different speeds. Cindy was still figuring out who she was. A young woman who had grown up too quickly in a glamorous world and still didn't know the difference between her real self and her public image. She was running from photo shoot to promotion, trying to keep her figure and please those who wanted to make her a living brand. At the same time, Richard was getting tired of the crowds after 20 years as Hollywood's dream man. His search for peace led him to meditate, do volunteer work, and hide away in quiet places away from cameras. They got married in Las Vegas in 1991, in a very private ceremony with silver foil rings. There were no guests or media, just the two of them trying to hold on to something beautiful that was starting to fade. But marriage doesn't fix being apart. When Richard meditated, Cindy got on planes. When he sat still and listened, she kept moving, trying to become the woman he needed. She once said, "I tried to become the woman he needed, and then I lost myself." There was no scandal or betrayal. There was just growing silence and two people living like roommates, with their schedules and emotions not matching up. They got a divorce in 1995, without any fights or bad words. The media didn't know what to write, so they just left a question mark. Why did the perfect couple break up almost 30 years later? Richard finally said it, "I loved a woman who didn't yet know who she was, and I thought love could help her find stability." But that was too much to expect. Neither of them was wrong. They just didn't meet at the right point in their lives. One was still flying, and the other had already landed. After his divorce from Cindy Crawford, Richard Gere stopped having loud relationships and stopped being on magazine covers with young supermodels. He instead stayed quiet, meditated, traveled around Asia, studied Tibetan Buddhism, and took on deeper, slower film roles. After some emotional upheaval, he met Carrie Lell, an actress who was famous as a Bond girl and licensed to kill. She was beautiful, experienced and calm. There was no glitz or frenzy. After meeting Carrie, Richard thought she was a peaceful place to end his life. They started dating in 1995 and lived together quietly. In 2000, their son Homer James Jigmar was born, making Richard a father for the first time at the age of 51. In 2002, they got married in a small ceremony. It was just a small family, choosing to live in Pound Ridge, New York, away from the attention of the public. Carrie spent most of her time being a mother there, away from the spotlight, while Richard grew vegetables, read books, made some films, and kept up his humanitarian work. But sometimes parallel patients create the illusion of stability. Two people were slowly drifting apart from each other. Richard was very shy, and spent hours meditating on retreats in Tibet or Nepal, where he was interested in the ideas of detachment and stillness. Carrie, on the other hand, needed connection, movement, and social space to feel alive, even though she wasn't in front of the camera as much as Richard. As time went on, they were seen together less and less. At ceremonies and film events, one would go while the other was absent because their schedules no longer worked. No one said it out loud, but silence started to speak. In 2013, after 11 years of marriage and 18 years together, Carrie Lell officially filed for divorce, saying that they could no longer live together. But people close to them said that Carrie felt cut off from her husband's life. She lived in a house, but didn't have the key to its spirit. Meanwhile, Richard still thought that silence was a sign of peace. It wasn't until things started to break that he realized that silence that lasts too long isn't peace. "I didn't hear it." The divorce took 3 years, not because of emotional problems, but because of money problems. They had assets worth more than $45 million and real estate in several places, which led to many court cases. But despite the stress, they did one thing right: they agreed to share custody of their son Homer. Someone said the boy was sensitive and calm, a lot like his father. Richard and Carrie didn't say anything after the divorce. There was just a deep, quiet feeling that something was broken. No one betrayed the other, and no one went astray. It was just that two people were too honest about who they were, and at some point they could no longer touch. After his divorce from Carrie Lell, Richard Gere almost disappeared from the media. He didn't show up at any award shows or do any interviews. People thought he had decided to spend the rest of his life being a father, a meditator, and a contemplative soul. But just when he thought he had found true love, it came along. In 2014, while his divorce from Carrie Lell was still being processed, Richard Gere appeared with a new face, Padma Malakshmi, a model, author, and host of Top Chef. The media was interested in the relationship, but it never made the news. There were no hand-in-hand photos or interviews confirming a romance. Instead, there were rumors that Richard and Padma met at a charity event, talked for hours backstage, and were sometimes seen having dinner together. Both of them had scars at the time. Richard was getting divorced after 18 years of marriage, and Padma had just broken up with billionaire Ted Forsman, who was the spiritual father of her young daughter. They found more in common than a spark of passion. During those few months, Richard found in Padma a quiet joy, long conversations, simple dinners, and no need to play a role. But they both knew they were in very different parts of their lives. Richard wanted peace, quiet, and meditation. Padma, on the other hand, was famous, lively, and drawn to the energy of TV and world events. After about 6 months together, they broke up in a nice, regret-free way. There were no fights or scandals. According to a close source, they decided to stay friends because their lives were too busy going in different directions. If this short relationship left me with anything, it was the image of Richard Gere, who had started to slow down. He was no longer loving because he was lonely or trying to fill a void. He was learning to accept that harmony can't be forced and that love alone isn't enough to keep someone. It's possible that that's where the need to search quietly went away. Richard Gere stopped expecting anything, like love or a miracle. It was at that exact moment that Alejandra Silva came into his life, without making a fuss, without needing to be held onto. As the saying goes, when you stop looking for love, love finds you. Richard Gere finally stopped chasing and trying to prove anything. After 3 marriages, a string of attractive but short-lived relationships, and years of moving between monasteries and movie sets. That's when Alejandra Silva came into his life. She wasn't as beautiful as Cindy Crawford, or as experienced on stage as Carrie Lell, but she had calm eyes, soft blonde hair, and the heart of a social activist. She never thought she'd fall in love again. She was raising her child by herself after getting divorced and running the Rise Foundation to help the homeless in Madrid. She had slept on the streets to understand how hard it was for people who didn't have a place to stay. She once said, "I don't do charity work to be seen. Why do I do it? Because I wouldn't do it if I couldn't give it my all." In 2014, they met again at a hotel owned by her family in Positano, Italy. Gere was quietly ending his second marriage, and she was also tired and covered in divorce papers. But when they looked at each other, they didn't see the past. They saw a peaceful future they could build together. As a whisper, Richard Gere took the first step. He sent her flowers every day, wrote short songs, and wrote letters. "I'm ready to stay if you need someone beside you," he said. Alejandra at first said no, because they were 33 years apart in age, and she knew he was a famous person around the world. She didn't want to be Richard Gere's next wife, but he didn't give up. Instead, he waited. He was just there, quiet and patient enough for her to see that this wasn't just another relationship, it was a home. They got married in April 2018, in a small Buddhist ceremony in New York. Alejandra became a Buddhist before the ceremony. Not because Guy asked her to, but because she loved the same things he did. "I didn't ignore the age difference," she said. "But when the karmic energy between two people is strong enough, differences become secondary." Later she said, "Hola, meeting Richard Gere felt like someone reaching out, pulling me out of the dark, and showing me the way. I got lost." They moved into a quiet house in Pound Ridge after the wedding. This is where Gere had lived with Carrie Lell. This time though, he didn't build walls. Instead, they left the doors open and lived together like friends, with no rules, standards or roles to play. In 2019, they had their first son, Alexander. In 2020, they had their second child, but they didn't tell anyone the name. The joy was still there. Alejandra often posted pictures on Instagram of family walks, yoga sessions, or their 2 kids reaching out to catch the fall sun. She's the funniest, smartest, most sensitive, bravest woman who knows what she wants. Richard Gere once said about his wife, "I don't need her to be someone else, and I don't owe her anything. He's the nicest man Alejandra has ever met, and I don't have to explain why we live close." A thoughtful partner, he writes her music every morning, and sends her flowers even after they're married. A calm father, he holds his kids as they fall asleep, and always puts his family first.
How do you keep love alive? The reason is that Richard Gere doesn't hold on. They don't hold on to each other as they walk side by side. They touch each other with understanding instead of expectation. They respect each other's differences, but don't try to become the same. One is deeply introverted and likes silence and meditation, while the other is outgoing and fights for human rights and the homeless. They met not because they were alike, but because they both felt a deep rhythm in their hearts. The man had been divorced 3 times, and the woman had been through the wreckage of marriage. But in the end, both of them understood that love isn't about holding on to someone, it's about never making them feel like they have to try to stay. Richard once said of his wife, "She is the most generous woman I've ever known with others, and with me." It was a simple line, but it told him everything he needed to know. Some relationships are based on passion, while others are based on commitment. There are also relationships, like the one between Richard Gere and Alejandra Silva, that happen not because one person is missing something or wants to fill a void, but because both people are already complete. Neither person came into the relationship looking for something, or hoping the other would fix them, complete them, or become someone they had imagined they would be. She didn't want Richard to be romantic like in the movies, and Richard didn't want her to look like any other woman he had met. They met with nothing to prove, and no one to hold on to. There were no media contracts, no reason to be seen in public, and no need to show wedding photos. Richard just wrote short songs every morning. People often say, if you want to keep someone, never let them feel like they have to work so hard to stay. And maybe Richard Gere took a long time to figure that out. But Alejandra, who had to deal with years of painful tender tears from a divorce, also learned that love doesn't make you lose yourself. The best kind of love lets you be yourself. They don't try to control each other. They don't have to keep track of schedules or explain their feelings. They just show up. They are present, and they live together with full understanding, like two people who have been through a lot of pain and now have found a place quiet enough to let something grow. Once upon a time, Richard Gere's face lit up every screen. Now he lives in a house where there are no reporters waiting at the gate. At 74, he doesn't regularly appear in the press, walk the red carpet, or answer the same old interview questions. No one knows what movie he's working on, because he might not be working on one. Or if he is, it's probably a quiet, independent project that doesn't need the box office or the Oscars. Instead of cameras, he now lives with Alejandra and their 2 young kids at a farmhouse in Pound Ridge, where the grass grows past the knees and the hills are covered in fog in the morning. Every day is real for him. He makes tea or coffee for his wife, without calling an assistant, walks the dog along the stone path behind the house, without the paparazzi, gardens, reads Buddhist texts, plays the piano for his kids in the evening, and sometimes drives them to school in an old SUV without bodyguards. He is still very close with humanitarian groups that work on Tibet, human rights, and homelessness, but he does all of this in private now. He doesn't give speeches, live streams, or awards. His wife Alejandra runs the Ray Foundation in Spain. They don't do charity to be praised. It's the right thing to do, and with their family, everything is kept secret. A picture of a walk in the woods in the fall, a Christmas picture with the words "From our home to yours, wishing you peace." Gere once said, "I don't need to be in Hollywood to know I still exist." He may not have officially retired because of this. Instead, he chose to quietly step back from everything. No more acting or roles, just living his life in the nicest way possible. Richard Gere used to be known for playing charming and magnetic men, but now he only has one role, and it may be the most important one of his life, being a father, a husband, and a peaceful man. Which of Richard Gere's love stories sticks out to you the most? Was it his beautiful marriage to Cindy Crawford, his long silence with Carrie Lell, or his quiet but beautiful life with Alejandra Silva? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you think love always comes late, comment, "Yes, I think so," to let us know that you believe in Richard Gere's love story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories about your favorite stars' life journeys.